A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars, they've been wrong about jobs, they've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. My name is Matt Wingard, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Welcome again to everyone from the Gab community who is listening. You can hear this podcast and previous podcasts of this show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast. It's even on YouTube. All you have to do is search for the Horrible Deplorable Show, and you should find it. We play on the405media.com on the weekends, Saturday and Sunday at 5 p.m. Matt Lauer and Garrison Keillor were the two big names that went down yesterday. It appears as if the guns are trained on Geraldo today. They're dredging up an old video of Bette Midler saying that he groped and accosted her back in the early 70s. And the prairie fire continues. We've got to be at over 100 prominent people in Hollywood and the media who have been identified, accused, and many of them driven from the field at this point. And as I've said before, I don't have any sympathy for the hardcore vocal liberals on this list, which is most of them, because they've created an environment where this is entirely possible. If this had been a witch hunt going on against Republicans, they'd be absolutely cheering it on. So I have no sympathy for those who are being consumed by that, who are on top. But, of course, as I've discussed before, prairie fires like this are all-consuming, and there are a lot of people that are going to be swept away in this who are not necessarily vocal liberals, and a lot of people sort of downscale economically who are going to be permanently scarlet-lettered like this, and their case will never really be adjudicated, or even if it is in court and they are exonerated, that will never really follow on the internet, and they'll never be shaken free of this. The thing about these charges, these sex-related charges, is that if you're, and this is mostly happening to men, if this happens to you, you absolutely cannot get the taint of it off of you. The internet is forever, as we've discussed before. The way that internet has changed things is that there's no fading memory with the internet. Everything that happened, no matter how long ago it was, is yesterday, as far as the internet is concerned. It's as if, think about a blaring headline that comes out. That blaring headline literally exists forever. So it doesn't fade away to the libraries and the microfiche over time. It's sitting there blaring that headline every single day. When your name or that person's name is typed in, bingo, there it is. And I got to thinking about the fact that when Matt Lauer, for instance, has, I don't know, it looks like he's going to have about 8 accusers. So, I'm not going to suggest that he's not guilty of the things that he's being accused of. But when this first started, it was one accuser, and I took notice of the fact that the paper published the article. A lot of the press went with the story originally and kept the accuser's name anonymous, which is not uncommon at all. Matter of fact, it's standard practice for the press in rape accusation cases for the accuser's name to be withheld. But it now has followed and expanded so that essentially any sex-related claim that in 99% of the cases a woman has made against a man, the press dutifully withholds her name, allows her to be anonymous. Now, of course, she can't be anonymous in court, but I think we need to recognize that with the internet keeping things forever, and with, as I said, it always being yesterday, this court of public opinion is as damaging, and it's as much a prison cell as anything that can happen in court. My mind went to the fact that when mobsters, who are historically have been some of the most ruthless people to try to bring to justice, when someone turns state's evidence against them, even though they're put in witness protection and they are helped, ultimately their name is known. The press does not disguise their name, and they do testify in court openly. The the mobster is allowed to face their accuser. And these are people who are facing the threat of death. Literally, they are facing the threat of death by people who are quite capable of finding them and executing them for testifying. And yet they are not given the shield of anonymity that is provided in sex-related charges. Now, at one time, it might have made sense when this society was still dealing with Puritan ideas of sex and the idea that, and this is in the way distant past, the press didn't even have this anonymity shield back at a time when, say, if a woman was raped, she might be considered unfit for marriage. I mean, you have to go back 100 years practically to get to a time like that, but the stigma certainly stayed around, probably much more recently. But the idea that today a woman who's making a sex-related charge against a man is somehow herself injured by that. Other than, of course, anytime you make a criminal charge against someone, your veracity is in play, and people have a right to make judgments about that. But I'm talking about just exclusively the idea that somehow you are sexually tainted, or that you're not marriage material, or things that would have been thought in the way distant past. None of that holds today. And yet the press dutifully allows for this very unique reality, which is that if you make a sex-related charge against another person in this country, the press will withhold your identity, and only around those charges. You accuse somebody of murder, you accuse somebody of robbing a bank, you can accuse somebody of very, very heinous things, and the press is not going to withhold your name. Only a sex-related claim.
Then why are some of the names coming out?
Well, those women voluntarily come forward. The general operating principle that the press has is if the woman is willing to be identified, if she self-identifies, then they will name her. But they automatically give anonymity, and they certainly will give anonymity if requested.
And what we've seen a little bit of as the anonymity at the beginning, and then other women join in, and then the first woman is willing to give her name then at that point.
Right. But I'm interested in the fact that this idea of being able to know who your accuser is a very old element of jurisprudence, and it's actually vital. I mean, it was considered vital for centuries. And again, every right that we have in the law is a right. It's very similar to the fact that we are immune to a lot of diseases. There's a great point made at the end of the movie War of the Worlds, and I'm thinking of the original, that the Martians all die because they are not immune from the diseases that are on the planet, and that we are saved, humanity is saved, because millions of our ancestors suffered horrible deaths in order to bring us this immunity, that essentially we've earned our right on this planet, which the Martians had not. And I think it's a similar analogy to what's in our jurisprudence and what's in our common law and the kinds of things that are embedded in our Constitution. People for millennia have been run through show trials and witch trials, and had the most important people in the society had their word considered to be gold, and poor people, their word was considered worth nothing. So if you accused a rich person of something and there was no evidence, they would always take the word of the wealthier person. In ancient Mesopotamia, you actually would lose your life for making a claim that you could not prove. Not a claim that was false, a claim that you could not prove against one of your betters. You literally sacrificed your life for that. And it's unimaginable because it's mostly unrecorded, but you have to spend a moment to think about how many people have suffered in the millions over the years to give us these constitutional protections that we have today. The right to a jury trial, and to not have a king or a potentate just make a decision about our lives, and a right to face your accuser, and a right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. These things are not just made up out of cold cloth. These aren't just things that a couple of men got in a room and said, well, it'd be kind of a good idea if. These are the result of tens of thousands, millions of people being brutalized by unfair and unjust systems. And these were, in many cases, riots and wars fought, including civil wars, fought to establish these basic rights for individuals. And we have allowed that right to be able to face your accuser to be very eroded. Now, again, it still takes place in the court, but we're not fully recognizing that these are concepts. It doesn't matter that it's just a legal concept. It's also a human right concept. So we embed it in the law, and we require the state to follow these rules in order to convict somebody and put them in prison. But that's all about power, right? It's the state's power to take away your freedom that is being essentially blocked with these requests. Well, the press has the power to put you in prison and to take away your freedoms because they can create these realities, these accusations that exist forever there as if they were yesterday. So the concept still holds. It doesn't matter that you still retain these rights in a court of law. You should have these rights within society as a whole as well, not just in a court of law. The idea that if somebody's going to accuse you of a heinous crime, the kind of crime that is an immediate taint that you can never get free of, that person should have to be public about their accusation. Let alone the fact that we absolutely refuse to hold people who make false allegations accountable. With regularity, we find out that a woman has not told the truth in something like this, and sometimes they're charged with a crime, but most often they are not. Now,
well, how do you expect women to remember exactly what happened all these many years ago, which is the case of many of these women saying things that happened?
That's a whole other issue when you're dealing with these issues of sexual harassment and rape and attempted rape and those kinds of things, because in almost all cases, the only two witnesses to the crime are the person being accused and the person doing the accusing. And so this comes down to an almost entirely an issue of witness veracity. And that's why most of these accusations that you see are never going to go to court. They're never going to be adjudicated in a court of law because most prosecutors would say, you know, when there's 8 of you, that's one thing. But when there's just a couple of you or one person making the accusation, we really won't be able to prove this. Jury's not going to convict on a preponderance of evidence standard. So what's happening in a lot of these cases is that these individuals, rich or poor, are never going to be given the benefit of an actual court case where they get to ask a jury to weigh the evidence. They're being summarily executed or unpersoned from society without even the benefit of any kind of a legal process of any kind. Now, the rich folks like Matt Lauer, it doesn't matter. I mean, he's going to hold a grudge, Bill O'Reilly, people like that, but they're wealthy. And so, you know, wealth has its own alternatives, and Bill O'Reilly can go sailing in the Caribbean if he wants to. I'm much more concerned about people downscale who, when they get tainted like this and driven out of society, you know, there are some people, and this is starting to trickle down to people in Hollywood who may eventually run out of money, either trying to sue or trying to pay off their debts or what have you, and they will not be able to find other employment. And as I said, as this brush fire moves along, it's going to start to consume a lot of people who you've never heard of. Going back to my point, I just feel like we have allowed ourselves, without really thinking about it, to severely damage a major tenet of a free and open society, which is that people accused of heinous crimes deserve to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, and that they have a right to face their accusers. It's not just this idea that the accused has the right to face their accuser. It's that if you're going to make a heinous charge against a person, you ought to be willing to stand up in public and stand behind that. The idea of creating a precedence of allowing anyone to make a heinous charge anonymously is an extremely dangerous precedence. Do you want people to be able to accuse other people of murder and not have their identity known? I mean, think about the heinous things that eventually people could be allowed to accuse other people of and never have to reveal their name. I think out of sympathy for women and out of a gentlemanliness and a kind of a past chivalry, we acquiesced on that early on without really thinking through the long-term consequences of allowing it to go on decade after decade. It's sort of like in the 60s, you might have been able to be talked into some of the affirmative action issues around blacks in America because you could recognize how discriminated against they had been, and this idea that for a period of time, maybe they need to be given some special treatment. At least some people could be convinced of that. You might at least entertain it as an idea, but remember that the people who lobbied for that bill, the people who actually voted for that bill in Congress at the time, were questioned on the floor about whether or not this would be permanent or temporary. And to a person, they assured everyone in Congress that, no, this would absolutely be temporary. Of course, it would make no sense for it to go on forever. It's a temporary measure. And yet, it has turned out not to be temporary. And it goes on and on and on, decade after decade. So the people who actually resisted it at the time and who were branded as racist, who said that they feared that this would not be temporary, were correct. And I just use that as an analogy to the idea that whatever sympathy there might have been early on to allow these kinds of charges to be made, maybe back in the 70s, you might allow an anonymity. There's not even a discussion about removing anonymity from these charges today, when I think everyone would agree that it's no taint on a woman's record for her to have been legitimately raped or attempted to be raped or to have been sexually harassed, and for her to come forward and say, this happened to me. There's absolutely nothing but sympathy out there for that. I think that we're losing a lot of freedoms. And I guess I ask the question because I hear from feminists this idea that, well, these are obviously he said, she said circumstances. It's about power dynamics. We need to make exemptions in the law. And actually, when it comes to rape cases, when you get into court, there actually are exemptions. You cannot vigorously cross-examine the accuser in a rape case the way that you can someone who's accusing someone of murder or robbery or other heinous crimes. And they claim you're slut-shaming or you're bringing up her past if you're trying to go after her veracity. All sorts of excuses for why rape cases should be special cases in jurisprudence versus other types of cases. But the thing about exceptions is they tend to spread. Once you've carved out an exemption in the law for an, X type of case, it's amazing how you can sit there and watch it creep to Y types of cases and Z types of cases and J types. I mean, it just moves. That's what precedents do in the law. They move around and they get used by clever lawyers. So you have to be very careful about giving up these kinds of freedoms. On top of all of that, consider that most people in the legal profession will tell you that witness testimony is the least reliable evidence. Do you know how many black men are in prison on witness testimony who the Innocence Project has gotten out because DNA evidence has come along and exonerated them? And yet, the exceptions that are being made specifically for witness testimony, the least reliable, and we've talked about this, the fact that human beings, our minds just don't tend to remember things like steel traps. That's not the way our minds work. Memories are very malleable, and there's been a lot of science around this, around the fact that people just don't tend to remember things exactly the way they happened. And the more time that goes on, the more the details change in that memory.
So I think there's several things happening out there in the general public. Number one, when all of these rich, powerful men have been accused, I think that the average person would say, it kind of figures, they have money, they think they can have whatever they want. But I wonder how they're going to feel when the trickle-down effect starts and someone they personally know is accused. Will they still feel the same about that? And the other thing that's going on is there's just so many of these now, people are going to lose interest.
That's another element of it, but there's certainly a lot of opportunity in the midst of a prairie fire or a witch hunt. That's when, when the mob takes to the streets, that's when a lot of scores get settled. I mean, when an actual mob takes to the streets, it starts out with a target, and then what'll happen is that mob will get hungry. It starts to feed on the violence, and so they move from their original target onto others or just targets of opportunity. But what also happens is a lot of people who have grudges sort of join in with the mob and use the mob as cover while all this violence is going off down the street. They move on the neighbor that they want dead for some reason. And what happens in the morning is the mob has killed a bunch of people and this neighbor is also dead, and the police never solve that crime because in the midst of all of this violence and mob outrage and murder and mayhem, it all just sort of blends together, and the neighbor is assumed to have been a victim of random violence. And that's what actually happens in real violent mobs, but I'm using it as an analogy that when you have something like this going on, it's entirely possible for there to be people out there. In this particular case, we're talking about women, but I just simply think of women as human beings who are as fallible and capable of doing good and evil as every other human being on the planet. There will be women who will use this as an opportunity to settle scores, knowing in the midst of a mob now where it's clear that if any accusation comes out, that person is pretty much summarily fired within 24 hours. That's a golden opportunity to settle scores.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because if a man complains that he was sexually harassed by a woman, you know what most men think? They think, wow, he almost scored.
There's that double standard, and then the idea that, of course, the flip side of what's not being discussed here is that when you have men like Charlie Rose and Matt Lauer and others who clearly have a pattern of exposing themselves and coming on to women very strongly, there's no way that this could go on for as long as it did without there being a lot of women who were people who said yes in these scenarios. I mean, if Matt Lauer starts locking the door to his office and coming on to women in the 1990s, and every single woman is aghast, slaps him across the face and walks out of the room, he keeps doing that for 25 years to get slapped in the face every day? No. Obviously, what you're seeing when these women who were horrified and who felt taken advantage of, when they describe these stories, what you're hearing is their moves, essentially. And obviously it was working with a lot of women because that's why it had become a pattern for them. And it's interesting that what we hear is from the women who were not amused and who were not interested and who wanted to get the heck out of there. But we're not hearing, obviously, from the women who were more than happy to say yes. I go back, I've used this reference before, but years ago, Saturday Night Live did this. They had Tom Brady on, and they did this really clever ad. It looked like an old General Electric instructional 16 millimeter film. So, it looked kind of grainy and black and white, and had the narrator who was, actually, Progressive has been kind of mocking these types of commercials with Flo recently too, where she's treated in a non-feminist fashion. But the whole video, or the film, the little 16 millimeter film, stars Tom Brady and Fred Armisen, and it's titled Sexual Harassment and You, and it's an instructional video about how to avoid sexual harassment claims. And through a series of vignettes, what happens is, Fred Armisen's not that good looking, and Tom Brady is very good looking. And so what'll happen is that Fred will come up and try to awkwardly talk to a female coworker, and she will pick up the phone and call HR because he's annoying her. And Tom Brady will walk up wearing nothing but a diaper. He's literally wearing nothing but a diaper, and start talking to her. And of course, she's immediately gaga because it's handsome Tom Brady, and she's sitting there acting all flattered that he's paying attention to her. And no one seems to care that he's just wearing a diaper, right? I mean, it's hysterically funny because of the clear double standard and the idea that sexual harassment is sometimes a matter of whether or not the woman is actually interested in the come-on that is occurring. And so, of course, at the very end of the film, they say, let's go over the rules. Rule number 1, be attractive. Rule number 2, don't be unattractive. And, it's funny because there's an element of truth in that. Part of what is being discussed here, and I don't necessarily have a problem with, is this idea of sort of aggressive, power-driven, attempted rape, which I think you can get near universal condemnation of. But mixed in that are sort of clumsy come-ons. And men being aggressive, but not necessarily being physically aggressive in their come-ons to women. And what we're hearing from is the women who weren't interested. But obviously there were women who were. And so there's a bit more complication to it, but none of that subtlety. You cannot stop and reason or ask for any kind of a complex conversation when a mob is raging. Mobs break things, they hang people, they stab people to death, and then they move on to their next target. And mobs are just groups of people who've lost their mind and are in the midst of a rage-driven scenario. And unfortunately, we are right in the middle of that hurricane right now. So no one wants to have a complicated conversation about dynamics between men and women and what happens when men and women are in the workplace and those dynamics follow them in. And men attracted to beautiful women, men attracted to women who are younger than them, women attracted to powerful men. nobody wants to have those conversations right now because we're in the midst of the sort of white hat, black hat phase of this mob action. I will say that this thing's been heating up, and it's, of course, allowed every angry feminist to simply rage about how wonderful it would be if there were no men, in the world. There's literally been tweets from prominent feminists saying, basically, we need to get all the men out of Congress. It should just be all women, and we need to have women running all the companies. Essentially a world without men. And so it just turns very quickly into male bashing. And I thought, how does that work politically for the Democrats? They've already done a pretty good job of driving white voters out of their party. And now they've done a pretty good job in driving straight men out of their party. And it started to dawn on me that this sort of hysterical mob action around these issues is very likely to drive minority men out of the Democrat Party. And I'm thinking specifically of black men, Hispanic men, Muslim men. They tend to be aggressive, not necessarily physically aggressive, but they come from cultures where when you're interested in a woman, you express yourself in kind of an aggressive manner, and that's depicted in films all the time. So I don't think I'm saying anything that comes as a shock to anyone, but I'm asking myself, men in these communities watching this sort of angry feminism and this sort of anti-male rhetoric that's flying around, how interested are they in the next election in voting for basically a Hillary Clinton party? An angry feminist Nancy Pelosi party.
But do they connect it with a party?
Well, I'm not necessarily convinced that these men will, if this keeps up and becomes kind of a major theme going into the next election, I'm not necessarily convinced that those men will vote for Republicans, but they may just not vote. They're not always the easiest demographics to get to vote in large numbers, and it's something the Democrats are constantly dealing with, is how to get out the vote in their minority communities. But I gotta think that the current Democrat Party, run by angry lesbians and anti-male urban women, is not going to be very appealing to Muslim men, black men, Hispanic men. Watch, I guess we'll see over the next couple of election cycles, but I don't see the electoral upside to a lot of the angry feminist rhetoric coming out of the left. It appears to me as if the only men left in the Democratic Party are the professional virtue signalers. And by professional virtue signalers, I'm talking about essentially celebrities or people who found a way to monetize their feminism. Then you have the womanizers, and I've made this point before that I think there are a lot of straight men in the Democrat Party, I'm talking about sort of active, vocal Democrats, who essentially use that virtue signaling as a way to get women. And some of this has been revealed in these scandals, at how many of these prominent virtue signalers behave pretty badly with women behind closed doors. And it's because they think that, this is their bait. Being this with the feminist movement is not something that they've internalized or they believe. It's just a way to bring the fishes in, to be surrounded by left-leaning women who they think are more sexually available, and they basically virtue signal as a way to please these women, to get these women interested in them. And then you have the gays. Of course, there's a lot of gay men in the Democrat Party. And then the hardcore socialists. But essentially, I don't see a lot of men being attracted to this party who don't fall into those categories. The professional virtue signaler, the womanizers, the gays, and the hardcore socialists. And, while that's a sizable group, it's nowhere near a majority. I saw the other day that CNN had haughtily announced that they would not be attending the White House Christmas party.
You suppose Trump is crying over that?
It's just amazing to me. I have like 6 different reactions to this. It would be like, I'm trying to think, it'd be like Bill Gates' son telling you that he's so mad at them he's no longer accepting Ferraris for Christmas. It's like, why would you care? And this is a privilege. This is the people's house, and the president lives there, and those reporters live in a rarefied world where they get to go to these kinds of parties and they get to be very close to power. And so when they say they're not going to attend, it's like, why would I care? Why would the average American care that they're not going to attend the White House Christmas party? I mean, I don't get invited to the White House Christmas party, and I most certainly would go.
Well, maybe they should offer you their invitation.
It's just a stunning example of the disconnect of these elites. Because it's obviously a virtue signal. I mean, who is it? It's the left. If you think they're not political, the only people who are going to care that they're making this sacrifice, in quotes, is leftists, politically active, hardcore leftists. So how do you argue that you are a mainstream, down-the-road news organization who just reports the facts and does not have a political bias when you make an obvious virtue signal to the left that you're going to boycott a White House Christmas party, which has no effect on anything other than to reinforce to your leftist buddies that you're in the resistance with them? It's a really stupid thing to do, but boy, it's illustrative. And we've gotten from Trump, he's forced, as I've said this before, he forces them all to paint a red dot on their forehead, identifying themselves as not neutral, not unbiased, but part of the whole communist left globalist movement. So I want to tell this story of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because I think the details are lost on a lot of people, and it's just another example of the need to drain the swamp, the bias in the media, and the way this 180-degree tactics that I've talked about with the Democrats, that they do or say whatever it takes to gain power, and that there's no moral compass there at all. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created under the Obama administration. It's essentially Senator Warren, Pocahontas' bureau. This is something that she wanted. And they specifically designed it to be autonomous. And so the person who's really kind of had her fingers on it the whole time is Senator Warren. And the guy the Republican Congress would not appoint or sanction, the Senate would not approve the person, Richard Cordray, that Obama wanted to appoint. Hardcore lefty, they refused. So he ended up recess appointing him, and then eventually in a compromise in which I think there was some horse trading, Congress essentially ratified his chairmanship of this bureau. Now, what does this bureau do? Well, if you ask Pocahontas, she's going to tell you that they keep an eye on Wall Street and they keep them honest. But actually what they do is what a lot like the EPA and others have been doing. And we talked about this before, about how the EPA would go and make threats against companies and then settle, essentially in exchange for the company writing a check to some leftist organization, usually an environmental group like the Sierra Club or Greenpeace or someone, so that group can turn around and continue to fund leftist activities. All of which helps the Democrats. It's essentially a way of creating a slush fund within the government to, just like the union dues. I mean, they have found all these clever ways to take your tax dollars and fund their party. And they've been doing this for years. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was another way to do that. They essentially harassed Wall Street firms. I'm sure there were some legitimate claims in there, but understand that when the full force of a federal agency is coming after you, what most firms will do is just say, what do you want? How do we settle this and make it go away? Even if they're not guilty, it doesn't matter. It's just basically institutionalized and legalized extortion. What the mob did routinely in New York, come around with the garbage company and say, there's only one garbage company you can hire, and it's us. And by the way, we will expect a nice cash envelope of $10,000 every month that will come around and collect. And if you wanted to run a restaurant, you had to do this. And it's the same thing. What happened with the Bureau is Wall Street just understood that this was an extortion racket, that eventually your turn would come. They would tell you they were going to bring some case against you or they're investigating you, but that if you wrote a check, essentially if you settled with them, it could all go away. And the settlement included writing a check to some leftist organization. And so they essentially, in the course of the life of this thing, and it's been, I don't know, 6-7 years, they've extorted billions of dollars from Wall Street firms and shoved them into leftist organizations to essentially keep up the leftist fight. Very clever, very clever. And so, of course, you can only imagine when the Trump people came in, they want this guy, Cordray, gone, and they want to rein in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What they essentially want to do is to stop those extortion payments. If you've got a legitimate case against a Wall Street firm, bring it, and the fines should come to the federal government. Don't settle by having them write some check to some lefty organization. Now, Senator Warren and others are out there using the leftist media to claim, well, they're just trying to help Wall Street and all of that. No, once you understand what's going on, it's very clear. They simply want to stop this funding of leftist organizations that the Bureau's been doing. So Cordray wants to return to Ohio and run for governor. And what he wants very much is for Trump to fire him so that he can have that as a PR stunt, and it helps raise his profile and gives him a much better chance in the Democrat primary in the race for Ohio governor. Well, the Trump people are wise to that, and they absolutely don't want to give him that. So they just decide, well, his term is up, essentially, in November, so we'll just wait him out. So then what he does is he's got a chief of staff by the name of Leandra English, and there's some reporting the two of them may have been involved with each other. But what he does is he decides to resign the day before his term would be up, and 24 hours before that, he appoints Leandra as the deputy for the Bureau, so that what happens when he resigns is she becomes the acting director. Well, Trump just ignores that and appoints his budget director, Mick Mulvaney, as the director of this Bureau. Well, the Democrats immediately claim that he can't do that and that Leandra is actually the acting director, and they go to court to try. Both of them essentially are showing up claiming to be the director of this Bureau, and she's got an office, because she's already there, and she's claiming that she's just issuing edicts and orders as if she's the acting director of this Bureau. It ends up in front of a judge who has just recently been appointed by Trump. So, of course, the Democrats immediately begin spinning it as, well, of course, it's going to be a Trump guy who's going to protect him. But the judge essentially threw out the lawsuit from the Democrats, saying that this raises way too many problems about the executive's authority to choose his own people for these agencies, and essentially says that, of course, the president has the right to appoint his own director. So Mick's in and Leandra's out. But what I find interesting is that if you follow this in the mainstream press, they don't give a lot of those details. And they leave you with the impression that this wasn't some last-minute 24-hour trick, that it's all just an attempt from the Trump people to squash this Bureau, and that it's a war between Elizabeth Warren, who's wearing the white hat, which is unusual for an Indian, and Donald Trump, who's wearing the black hat. But it's such an obvious ruse, and it's such an obvious power play, and it's so obviously not legal, and yet you don't get that reporting from the press. A lot of what they do in a story like this is just play it down the middle. When it's clearly a power play by the Democrats, they don't even report the details. Imagine if Republicans had tried this. The Democrats literally tried to continue controlling a government agency, and they tried to prevent the duly appointed director of this Bureau, who the president wanted, from being able to run it. Everything with Democrats is a will to power for them. So I've been listening to this podcast, The History of Rome. It's old. It was actually done in 2010 or so, and so it's completed. I'm on, I don't know, about 100, episode 119, somewhere around there, and I think it has about 160 or so episodes. And it's essentially the 1,000-year history of Rome told in a little under 200 podcast episodes. I'm fascinated by ancient Rome, and I read a lot about that and digest a lot because I find the whole period and the fact that they were able to control the Mediterranean for such a long period of time fascinating. And I think there are a lot of similarities to other empires, including the American Republic, but that's maybe for another podcast. What I want to talk about today is the conclusions. We're well into the 3rd century AD in the podcast for me, and my takeaway for the sort of slow degradation of the empire is that the Romans were unable to adjust their governing structure to meet the needs of their changing empire. So they start out as a city-state, and they essentially are citizen warriors who come from their farms and bring a horse, and their military is fielded from their own citizens. And then over a period of time, they conquer all of Italy, the other tribes. And there's what essentially happens during that and the Punic Wars with Carthage is the empire is expanding, and most of the soldiers are coming from these other tribes in Italy, and yet those folks are not as enfranchised, and they don't want to give them citizenship, and there are some civil wars over that struggle. And all of that eventually leads to full citizenship throughout the entire peninsula. And then ultimately the Republic dies and it becomes an empire under Augustus Caesar, and then Julius Caesar, and then Augustus. And then you have the empire for a few hundred years, but within about 150 years, the Senate is essentially a dead letter. It's just sort of there, but it doesn't really have any power. The emperors pretend to consult the Senate when they really just threaten it in order to get what they want. And then eventually they stop pretending, and everything is essentially run from the executive all the way. Now, why is that all happening? Because the empire is expanding, right? When it was just Romans, it was one thing, and then it was Romans and Italians, and they had some struggles in trying to admit that to themselves and allowing those folks to be fully enfranchised. And then ultimately, they had Gaul and Spain, and they had Syria and all of these other places, and those people wanted to be, they were using all those people for their soldiers, and those people wanted to be enfranchised as well. And so this idea of having a Senate in Rome of a few hundred men making the decisions, and they were the ones running through all of the different offices and serving, made less and less sense as the character of this empire changed. And of course, they have a lot of fights and civil war battles over even allowing these foreigners to be in the Senate. And ultimately, I'm at a point now in the podcast, in the history of Rome, where they temporarily break into three. There's the West, there's the Italian portion, and then there's the East, all with people who claim to be emperors, and they create their own senates. And this does last for a very short period of time, and eventually the empire is reunited again. But it points to the fact that what was clearly going on was this pressure in these areas of, how come I don't have a local body of people making the decisions around here who can make rapid response decisions around the Germans and others who are invading? We can't wait for a Senate all the way over in Rome to make decisions. And so what essentially I think brings the Romans down is that they cannot, because it's difficult, because institutions form over time, and then people get invested in those institutions, and power is distributed through those institutions. And so when there's suddenly a need to change the governing institution to reflect the reality of society, of course, everybody with power in your society is invested in the old way of doing things, and they absolutely do not want to change to the new way, because that is a redistribution of power. And, through fits and starts and a lot of death, the Romans are sort of forced to make these changes time and time again, but eventually they just can't. And although I haven't gotten to the end yet, what's going to happen is that this structure is just too old, too unable to adjust the new reality, because what Romans were struggling with in the end was that they had been an aggressive power, expanding their boundaries, and a lot of their government structure and the way they rotated people through military service was designed to enforce that the borders were always moving out. But then the sort of second half of the Roman Empire is them establishing sort of permanent borders, and then they have this vast trading empire, and so what they're now doing is sort of just governing to keep what they have. But when you're not aggressive, and everything you're doing is not pointing towards being aggressive, you become a pretty vulnerable target, because you have very, very long, stretched out borders that go all the way from Britain to Turkey and to Armenia, and then across Africa. You have all of this pent-up aggression of these tribes outside who can sort of raid indiscriminately in and out, stealing your goods. You've created this vast difference between your more wealthy Romanized society on one end of those boundaries and the tribal societies on the other side, who essentially are professional raiders. And what I'm seeing now in the podcast is just an inability to restructure their government in order to respond to that reality and to be able to hold on to what they have. And I say all of this to make the point that I see a lot of those parallels in the United States. We have, through immigration, changed our country in a way that it's not the same as the people who originally founded it. The Romans dealt with exactly that issue and didn't deal with it particularly well. And we also have a structure, a federalist structure, this idea of autonomous states and a smaller federal government. Well, as the country's gotten large and big and massive, and it trades internationally, and it has tentacles everywhere, whether you agree with that or not, that makes it difficult to have 50 autonomous states. It creates a lot of pressure for the centralization that we've seen in our federal government. That is precisely what the Romans dealt with as well, and that's why ultimately they had it turned into an empire with an emperor rather than a senate, which was the sort of diffused power. It became much more concentrated power because decisions had to be made, and they had to be made for the whole area, and everybody needed to move quickly when those decisions were made. So the deliberation stopped, or there was a lot less deliberation allowed as the empire grew in size and scope. We deal with those same things. And then I think about how the Senate sort of went from being the absolute center of decision-making and power to ultimately being a shell of itself, where they, for everyone's sake, they sort of pretended to be consulted and they pretended to make the decisions. For instance, the emperor would be chosen by the soldiers, and then the Senate would ratify that. Of course, in the Senate's mind, they're the ones actually making that person emperor, but the person's already actually been emperor, and now the senators face the threat of losing their heads if they don't walk into the Senate chamber and make him emperor. So there's this kabuki theater of the Senate has proclaimed that so-and-so will be emperor, when they did no such thing. They're simply a rubber stamp doing what the more powerful entities in society are simply telling them to do. And that proceeds for a couple hundred years. And then ultimately everyone sort of has grown very used to this farce. And so at some point emperors just stop even consulting the Senate. And have we not seen that same process in our own government, where we had a house that was supposed to be representing the people at the federal level, and over time, as the country's population grew, the number of House members was increased and increased and increased. But 100 years ago was the last time we've increased the number in the House of Representatives. It stopped at 435. And so what's happened then, as the population has continued to grow, is that the number of people within each district has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. It used to be that a congressman represented 100,000 people or less. Now most state representatives represent those kind of numbers. And congressmen and women represent 1 million people each. A little less. It can be somewhere between 900,000 to 1 million people. You're not going to meet most of those people. That creates a tremendous distance between that congressperson and the people that they represent. And so what has happened, because people are not able to be as intimately involved with their own representative, is that we've done this by proxy. That's why you have all this whole lobbying class, and people gravitate towards the interest, rather than supporting their congressman, they gravitate towards the interests they care about. If they're an NRA member, or if they're a strong environmentalist, maybe they hew tightly to the Sierra Club. And it's those lobbyists from those groups that go and have the intimate contact with the congressman on your behalf. And this is what has allowed the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to have a tremendous amount of power in Congress. And so what we see is we're sort of in that, we're moving into that middle phase where Congress still has power, but outside forces are actually more powerful, and they're exerting that power and influence on Congress, and Congress is becoming somewhat of a rubber stamp. This is not exactly totally there yet, but you can see us moving into that phase where Congress simply pretends to come up with the idea, pretends to be the ones enacting the law, but really the lobbyists right now are writing the laws, and then they give them to the Congress, and there is actual discussion that goes on, but for the most part, these are foregone conclusions.
So do you think that Trump expected the power to be in the hands of the lobbyists rather than the congressmen?
I think he's fully aware of this reality. It existed before him. It's part of what he talks about with draining the swamp. But I'm not sure at the level, the population level that we have, and the fact that our government structure, as it's currently constituted, doesn't really allow for that kind of intimate contact I was talking about. So this is, what happens is things compensate. Power just compensates. And so if the system isn't working, an ulterior system is created to make it work. And that's, this whole lobbying class allows people to pick 2 or 3 issues that they care about. Then they sort of gravitate towards those groups, and those groups exert influence on the Congress. I think that's a natural outcrop of the fact that congressmen don't represent 60,000 people anymore. They represent 960,000 people.
Is this why we have so many more departments spinning off of the major departments?
Yeah, that's just absolutely an outgrowth of the size and scope of the government. And then these things begin to just feed on themselves. I mean, government, the most significant thing that government does is reproduce itself. Sure, it does provide benefits and it does all these other things, but those are all designed to help it. It's essentially an autonomous beast now, and it grows on its own. And the one thing you can count on the government to do is just to grow. That's what it does, as if it's a living, breathing thing. And what Congress now fights about is just the rate of that growth. Is it going to grow by 2% this year, or is it going to grow by 5% this year? But the idea that it would actually shrink, no. When you see Republicans fighting around, budget cuts, they're just cutting the growth.
So you're not really shrinking government, you're shrinking the growth of government.
Right.
Ah.
So I think we are kind of in that phase. I think there are parallels with what happened to the Roman society and Roman government over time. And if I'm correct, and we're sort of in this second phase of our government structures, in this case, our Senate. When I talk about the Roman Senate, I would compare that just to the entire U.S. Congress. Essentially, that is in that second phase where they're becoming less and less a deliberative body and more of a rubber stamp of decisions that are made outside of them. But they're allowed to retain, just like Roman senators, they're allowed to maintain their position and their power, and they kind of go through this kabuki dance of pretending to pass these things when really the decisions have already been made. Well, okay, so what comes after that? The third phase is somewhere down the line, eventually the powers just stop asking the Senate to even bother. In this case, our Congress. And that could be decades down the road, but that is the trajectory that I see us on. So Doris and I saw 3 billboards on Tuesday, and we had dramatically different reactions to that. I think I'm going to let Doris go first so that she can praise it if she'd like before I absolutely lambast this film. Doris?
I enjoyed the film because the acting was great. I particularly like the lead lady. Is that Frances McDormand or something like that?
Yes.
So I enjoyed it, and I didn't take it as a political threat like Matt did. To me, it was just a story. So, although I wouldn't be probably recommending it to any friends, I probably would give it a B-.
So this movie gets an F from me. I think it is the most anti-American film of the year. And as such, as you can imagine, it's already got a tremendous Oscar buzz. And I think this movie is going to do well at the Golden Globes and at the Oscars. Because there's nothing that Hollywood elites love more than movies that hate on America and Americans. Every character in this movie, it's basically a movie about a woman whose daughter has been raped and murdered. She was set on fire not too far from the house one night after she left. And it's been about a year since the teenage daughter's death, and the mother feels like the police are not even trying to solve the case. This is all taking place in a rural Missouri town. And so she's trying to shame the police force into solving the crime. And then there's an ex-husband, there's a brother, there's a sheriff, there are deputies, there are other townspeople, and so there's a bunch of other stories. But that's the central plot point that's driving everything. Every character in this movie is vile, foul-mouthed, except for a few meek people who act like they're trapped in this town. What, there's no bus station? They can't get free? It is filled with racism and homophobic characters. So they're either racist or homophobic. This film exudes hatred for the South, for rural America, for men, for cops. Does it sound familiar? Because it is clearly aimed right at Trump's deplorables. The writer is Irish, is an Irish playwright. I'm not even going to give him the dignity of saying his name. But he clearly, this is his caricature of rural America. And he obviously circulates in rarefied elite urban circles where he can tell a story like this and everybody's going to love him for it because this is the way they think about all the rubes out in rural America as well. The sort of good, slightly better than the other characters in this movie is the sheriff played by Woody Harrelson, who is foul-mouthed in front of his own little daughters at the dining room table, in which he then sort of says, "Sorry, girls," and that's supposed to be like funny that he's saying all these vile, foul-mouthed things in front of them. He's a homophobe, and he's supposed to be the good guy, or at least partly good guy in this story. I cannot imagine that Missouri residents who see this movie and I encourage you not to, would be pleased with the way that they are portrayed in this film, let alone any cop in a rural town anywhere in America. I cannot stress enough to avoid this movie if you are conservative in any way, shape, or form, because it feels as if this guy was so angry about the election that this was cathartic for him to sit down and write this movie where he could essentially attack all the people that he thinks of in his mind elected President Trump. And this whole idea of America. This is similar to the movie American Beauty that Kevin Spacey was in years ago, which the Academy loved and gave the Best Picture Oscar to. It's a story about a guy and his wife, Annette Bening, who essentially are middle class, but he's going through a midlife crisis. And the subtext of that movie is genuinely anti-American because essentially everybody in the suburbs is unhappy, which is the way that elites and Hollywood elites who live in urban environments, the cloud cities that I've talked about in the past, they think of that as just a vast wasteland, suburban. Contrast American Beauty with any Steven Spielberg movie like E.T. or a John Hughes movie. These are movies made about people in the suburbs that show a much different... And not everyone's happy in those movies, but the idea that the suburbs are a living hell, no way. Most John Hughes movies and Steven Spielberg movies project the suburbs of America as sort of Americana. And yet American Beauty projects this idea of the suburbs as a living hell that must be escaped. Filled with, the neighbor's a Nazi. In that movie, the next door neighbor is an actual neo-Nazi. How many people in the suburbs live right next to a neo-Nazi? It's nuts. It's nuts. And this movie does not take place in the suburbs. It takes place in a rural town in Missouri, but it is the exact same thing. It's portrayed as if it's some kind of living hell. And I'm thinking, why would anybody live there in this community? It's like, there are roads. You can just drive to St. Louis if that's where you'd rather live, or Chicago or New York. It's so dark and so unredeeming. I cannot stress enough that not only should this movie, it's just a waste of, I agree that the people involved, Woody Harrelson, Sam Rockwell, Frances McDormand, they're all talented actors, but they're completely wasted in this unredeeming film. Avoid it. There's a Harry Potter marathon coming to HBO in January, and I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. What I find interesting is that J.K. Rowling, who is this totally unrepentant leftist and elitist, what's interesting is that she espouses all these liberal views, but if you actually read the Harry Potter books and you follow the stories, these are very conservative stories. From a sexual standpoint, from a war and violence standpoint, and certainly the idea that, the wizards are all armed and they defend themselves. And the themes within Harry Potter are very conservative about family and honor and good and evil and protecting your loved ones and making sacrifices. Very, very conservative stuff coming out of this liberal woman. But of course, as with most folks, she knew how to make money. She made her billions by being a conservative. And then she spends her billions and her mouth by being a liberal. So I highly recommend checking out. The whole marathon is going to be on HBO in January, as I said. I was not a huge fan of Magical Beasts and Where to Find Them when it came out last year. And I couldn't really put my finger on why. I felt like it kind of had a meandering plot. Was too much concentration on all the CGI destruction, but not a lot on an actual plot that was involving the way the Harry Potter movies had been. Well, I just rewatched the movie the other night, and I put the closed captioning on, and it literally solved the problem for me. I realized that what really made that movie not work was that this Eddie Raymond, who is the British actor who plays the lead character, he's a mumble mouth. And the problem with any kind of a Harry Potter universe movie is it's like a Star Trek or Star Wars movie. There's a lot of jargon and invented words or animals, that are magical, and so they have a unique name. And you need to be able to pronounce that stuff. You got to get it out. The exposition has to be laid out there. And as soon as I could read what was being said, I actually followed the movie much better, understood things much better, and enjoyed it a lot more. And they're going to make like 5 of these with him, and I hope somebody has figured out that he has got to do a much better job of pronouncing some of this stuff and get the cotton out of his mouth.
Elocution lessons for him.
So we're just about out of time, but you can always find these episodes on your favorite podcast app, things like iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, even YouTube. We need to grow. This is a labor of love, but I'm asking you to take a moment to share this with someone you know so that we can grow our audience. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.